The thick, black smoke rose into the Lagos sky as flames consumed a flat on the third floor of a red brick building. People gathered around, shouting in alarm, some shaking their heads while others murmured prayers and made the sign of the cross. "God forbid bad thing," a woman exclaimed, holding her children close. Another man muttered, "That house again. How many more times will this happen before people learn?" The oppressive Lagos sun beat down mercilessly on Ima Mcpaya as she stood outside the small room they had called home for nearly 5 years. Their belongings, worn-out furniture, battered suitcases, and a patched mattress, were strewn haphazardly on the street. Passers-by cast fleeting, pitying glances at the family, some shaking their heads while others muttered, "Iya." Life hard for everybody. Effiong sat on an overturned bucket, his hands gripping his head. His usually stoic demeanor cracked under the weight of the eviction, the stares, and the shame. "I swear I tried," he mumbled, almost to himself. "Papa Idara, what will we do now?" Imam asked, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. She glanced at her children. Idara, her eldest at 13, stood protectively by the heap of belongings. Fontaine tugged at her skirt. "Mama, I'm hungry," he whispered. Nkoyo, the youngest, sat on the mattress, clutching a doll with a missing arm. Effiong exhaled deeply, standing up and brushing the dust off his trousers. "We'll find something. We can't just sit here." The family wandered through Lagos, weaving between vendors and shouting over one another in crowded streets. They stopped by a few buildings with to let signs, but the rents were far above what they could afford. As the sun began to set, they found themselves on a quieter street lined with aging apartment blocks. Most buildings looked weathered, but one stood out, a 5-story house built with striking red bricks that gleamed under the fading sunlight. "Effiong, look." Imam nudged her husband. The building had a small vacancy sign hanging on its gate. It looked clean, inviting even, and distinctly better maintained than the rest. Fiong hesitated. "We should ask about the rent first," he said cautiously. As they approached, a tall, smiling man stepped out of the building as though he had been expecting them. He wore a bright white shirt and black trousers, his face illuminated by a grin that seemed too wide. "Good evening. I am Mr. Ozumba, the landlord," he greeted warmly, his tone oozing enthusiasm. "You're looking for an apartment?" Effiong nodded, visibly relieved by the man's pleasant demeanor. "Yes, but our budget. It's tight." Ozumba's smile grew wider. "Not to worry. I have a lovely 2-bedroom flat on the 2nd floor. You'll love it. Affordable rent, steady water supply, reliable electricity, and," he lowered his voice conspiratorially, "the neighbors here are good people, quiet, peaceful, perfect for a family like yours." The family exchanged hopeful glances. Effiong asked how much. When Mr. Ozumba named the price, Imam's jaw dropped. It was shockingly affordable, far below anything they'd seen all day. "Is there something wrong with the apartment?" Imam asked suspiciously. Ozumba chuckled, waving her concern away. "Madam, nothing at all. The previous tenants just relocated. Lagos is like that, people move often. Come and see for yourself." The flat was surprisingly spacious. The walls were freshly painted, the floors tiled, and the windows large enough to let in plenty of light. Imam walked through each room, marveling at the kitchen's clean countertops and the bedroom's generous sizes. "It's perfect," she murmured, already imagining how she'd arrange their few belongings. Effiong, however, frowned as he examined the ceiling. "These cracks. They're small, but they might cause problems during heavy rain." Before he could press further, Mr. Ozumba clapped his hands. "Ah, Mr. Effiong, don't worry. I have the best houses in Lagos. I'll have it fixed tomorrow if you move in today." Nkoyo, who had been unusually quiet, tugged on Imam's hand. "Mama, I don't like the smell," she said softly. Imam sniffed the air. "What smell, Nkoyo?" "I can't smell anything. It's like something old," the little girl replied, wrinkling her nose. "Ah, children," Ozumba said, laughing nervously. "She'll get used to it." The paint is still fresh, that's all. Despite their reservations, the price and location were too good to pass up. By the next weekend, the Ikpaya family had moved into the second-floor flat. Their neighbors, a reserved couple named Mr. Ajaluchukwu and a friendly widow, Mrs. Chioma, helped them settle in. For the first time in months, Imam allowed herself to hope. "Maybe this is the new beginning we've been praying for," she whispered. For the first time in months, Imam allowed herself to hope. "Maybe this is the new beginning we've been praying for," she whispered to Effiong as they lay on their mattress that night, the hum of the ceiling fan lulling them to sleep. But deep in the stillness of the night, Nkoyo woke up, clutching her doll tightly. She stared at the corner of the room, where shadows danced in the faint moonlight. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's someone in the corner." The shadows didn't move. It was a calm evening in the red brick building when Imam first noticed something odd. She stood by the window, folding clothes, and counted the empty balconies. "Effiong," she called, setting down the clothes. "Do you know that 6 families have moved out in just 1 month?" Effiong, sitting cross-legged on the floor, didn't look up. He was busy fiddling with the back of their old television. He muttered, uninterested. By the second month, the number of empty flats rose to 8. Each time someone left, the sound of moving trucks and hurried footsteps filled the air, but no one ever said goodbye or explained why they were leaving. By the third month, only 3 families remained. The Ikpayas, Mr. Ajaluchukwu, and Mrs. Chioma. Late one night, as the children slept, Imam brought up her worries again. She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her wrapper. "Effiong, I don't understand. Why is everyone leaving this building so quickly?" Effiong, still adjusting the knobs on the television, replied without looking at her. "Imam, people move in and out of Lagos all the time. Some find cheaper places. Others go closer to their work. It's normal. Stop worrying." "But this doesn't feel normal," she pressed. "What if there's something wrong with this house? What if—" Effiong waved her off. "You're just imagining things. Don't let these thoughts disturb you." Despite Effiong's dismissive attitude, Imam couldn't shake the uneasiness growing inside her. She started watching the building more closely. Every few days, someone would come to inspect one of the empty flats. They would look around, nodding as Mr. Ozumba showed them the rooms, then leave with a promise to return. But they never came back. One afternoon, Imam stood on the balcony, wiping sweat from her brow as she washed Nkoyo's school uniform. Across the street, she saw a woman who had just toured the building stop at Mama Anurika's petty shop. The two exchanged a few words. The woman's face twisted into a frown, and she quickly walked away, not even glancing back at the red brick house. This wasn't the first time Imam had noticed this pattern. It was always the same. People inspected the house, visited Mama Anurika's shop, and then disappeared. "That's strange," Imam murmured to herself. Unable to contain her curiosity, Imam decided to speak to Mama Anurika. She waited until the evening when the small shop was less crowded, and approached the older woman with a warm smile. "Mama Anurika, good evening." "Oh," Imam greeted, picking up a pack of groundnuts from the counter. "Good evening, my daughter," Mama Anurika replied, her wrinkled hands arranging bottles of soft drinks on a shelf. Imam hesitated, unsure how to begin. She decided to ease into the conversation. "This your shop is always busy, eh? You must know everything that happens in this area." Mama Anurika chuckled lightly. "Ah, we traders see and hear a lot. What can I do for you?" Imam lowered her voice, leaning in closer. "Mama, I've been watching. People come to look at the empty flats in my building. They seem interested at first, but after stopping here they never return. Why? Do you tell them something about the house?" For a moment, Mama Anurika's face froze. She quickly regained her composure, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a bottle of water. "Ah, madam, you know how it is. Maybe they find another house that is cheaper or closer to work." "But Mama, this has happened too many times," Imam insisted, her voice firm but still polite. "Is there something I should know about this house?" Mama Anurika glanced around nervously, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Then she gave a tight smile and shook her head. "There's nothing, my dear. Don't worry yourself. Just face your family and your business." Imam's eyes narrowed. Mama Anurika was hiding something, but she clearly wasn't ready to talk. "All right, Mama. Thank you," Imam said, forcing a smile as she handed over the money for the groundnuts. As she walked back to the building, her uneasiness deepened. The older woman's nervous behavior only confirmed what she already suspected. Something was definitely wrong with the red brick house. That night, Imam lay awake long after Effiong and the children had fallen asleep. She couldn't stop thinking about the empty flats, the disappearing tenants, and Mama Anurika's reluctance to speak. Just as she began to drift off, a loud creak echoed through the hallway outside their flat. Her eyes flew open, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up, straining her ears. For a moment, all was silent. Then, faintly, she heard it again. The sound of soft footsteps, as if someone was pacing just outside their door. Imam held her breath, her eyes darting to the door. The footsteps stopped suddenly, followed by a low, indistinct murmur like someone whispering. She wanted to wake Effiong, but something stopped her. Instead, she clutched the edge of the blanket, her heart racing. After a few minutes, the sounds faded away, leaving her in an unsettling silence. Whatever was happening in this house, she was determined to find out. The Ikpaya family's life in the red brick house, which once seemed like a blessing, had turned into a chain of bad luck. It started with Effiong. Just 3 months after moving in, he came home earlier than usual one afternoon. His face clouded with frustration. "Effiong, you're back early," Imam said, surprised. She was sitting at the dining table, hand-stitching a customer's blouse. "I lost the job," he muttered, slumping into a chair. Imam froze. "What do you mean? What happened?" Effiong rubbed his hands over his face. "I had a disagreement with my boss. He accused me of spoiling a customer's car, but I didn't even touch it. No matter what I said, he wouldn't listen. He fired me on the spot." Imam dropped the blouse, her heart sinking. "God, what are we going to do now?" "Effiong, we barely have enough to pay rent as it is." Effiong didn't reply. He stared at the floor, the lines of worry on his face deepening. A few weeks later, another problem surfaced. Mfon, their bright 10-year-old son, came home from school with tears in his eyes. "Mama, the teacher punished me today," he said, sniffling. "What did you do?" Imam asked, surprised. Mfon was known for being one of the best-behaved students in his class. "The teacher said I failed the math test," Mfon explained, his voice shaky. "But Mama, I know I answered all the questions right. I even checked my work twice." Imam frowned. "Failed? That doesn't sound like you." She took the test paper from his bag and stared at it. Sure enough, there were red marks all over it. But as she looked closer, some of the corrections didn't make sense. "Mfon, I'll talk to your teacher tomorrow," she promised, pulling him into a hug. The next day, Imam visited the school, but the teacher insisted Mfon had made the mistakes. The incident didn't make sense to Imam, but she let it go, hoping it was just a one-time issue. But it wasn't. Mfon's grades continued to drop, and he became quieter and more withdrawn at home. Meanwhile, Imam's tailoring business, which had been her family's financial lifeline, began to falter. Customers who once praised her skill now complained about her work. Orders that were usually abundant during festive seasons dwindled to almost nothing. One afternoon, her best customer, Mrs. Bassi, came to pick up a dress. "Imam, this dress is ruined," she said sharply, holding up the gown. "Ruined? No, I followed your measurements exactly," Imam protested. But when she looked closely, the seams were uneven, and the fabric was torn in places. Imam's heart sank. She had checked the dress thoroughly the night before, and it was perfect. "Mrs. Bassi, I swear I don't know how this happened," Imam said, close to tears. The woman shook her head. "I can't wear this, Imam. I'll have to find another tailor." As she walked out, Imam slumped into her chair, staring at the ruined dress. She felt like something was working against her, ruining everything she tried to build. One evening, as Imam was sweeping the living room, she overheard Mrs. Chioma talking to another neighbor in the hallway. "Did you hear what happened to the Martins?" Mrs. Chioma asked, her voice hushed. "The Martins," the other woman replied. "Yes, their house caught fire last week. They lost everything. They were lucky to escape with their lives," Mrs. Chioma said. Imam paused, her hands tightening on the broom. The Martins were one of the families who had moved out of the red brick house. "That's strange," the neighbor said. "Do you know that the Oluyemis also had a fire in their new place? Just 2 weeks ago." Hearing this, Imam's skin prickled. 2 families who had left this building had experienced mysterious fires in their new homes. She hurriedly finished sweeping and went to find Effiong. That night, as the children slept, Imam sat on the edge of the bed, her face filled with worry. "Effiong, something is wrong in this house," she said, her voice trembling. Effiong sighed, already anticipating another of Imam's concerns. "What now? Have you noticed how nothing is going well for us since we moved here?" she asked. "You lost your job. Mfon, who was one of the best students in his school, is now failing. My business is barely surviving. And have you heard about the families who moved out? 2 of them have had fires in their new homes." Effiong frowned. "Fires? What does that have to do with us?" "I don't know, but it's too much to be a coincidence," Imam replied. "And have you seen Mr. Ozumba? He's always buying new things. New cars, new furniture, spending money lavishly at the beer parlor, and his family lives abroad. It's like the more we struggle, the better his life gets." Effiong leaned back against the wall, rubbing his temples. "Imam, you're jumping to conclusions. Life is hard for everyone. Maybe he's just lucky." "Lucky?" Imam's voice rose. "Effiong, something is feeding off us in this house. Feel it. We need to do something before it destroys us completely." But Effiong didn't reply. He lay down on the mattress and turned his back to her, unwilling to entertain what he thought were her wild ideas. Imam, however, couldn't shake the growing fear in her heart. Something dark was at work in the red brick house, and she wasn't going to wait for it to destroy her family. Imam was at her wits' end. The bad luck that had plagued her family was too much to ignore. With Effiong dismissing her fears and refusing to act, she decided to take matters into her own hands. One of her neighbors had once mentioned a prophet named Ezekiel, a man known for unraveling spiritual mysteries. Though skeptical, Imam felt she had no other option. One humid morning she left home early, carrying nothing but a small bag and a desperate prayer in her heart. She traveled across the city to the prophet's humble prayer house, hidden in a quiet corner of Lagos. When Imam arrived, she was surprised to find a line of people waiting outside the small, whitewashed building. Inside, faint chants of prayers echoed, creating an atmosphere that felt both calming and intense. She waited her turn and was finally ushered into a dimly lit room where Prophet Ezekiel sat on a simple wooden chair, his Bible resting on his lap. "Welcome, my sister," he said, his voice calm but commanding. His piercing eyes seemed to look straight into her soul. "Prophet, I need your help," Imam began, her voice trembling. She explained everything: the red brick house, the misfortunes, the strange fires, and her landlord's suspicious prosperity. Prophet Ezekiel listened quietly, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he closed his eyes and began to pray, his voice rising and falling in a rhythm that filled the room with an eerie energy. After several minutes, he opened his eyes, his expression grim. "My sister," he said slowly, "what I'm about to tell you is not easy to hear." Imam's hands tightened on her lap. "Please, Prophet. I need to know the truth." Prophet Ezekiel leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your landlord, Mr. Ozumba, is part of a secret cult. This cult thrives on the suffering and misfortune of others. The house you live in was built with bricks consecrated in blood, sacrifices made to bind the house to dark powers. Anyone who lives there either loses their life or their destiny. Their hardship feeds his wealth and success." Imam gasped, her heart pounding. "Blood. Sacrifices." Prophet, are you saying this man has been using us, our family, for his gain? Yes, Ezekiel replied solemnly. This is why your troubles began the moment you moved in. The house is cursed, and until the curse is broken, anyone who steps inside will suffer. Imam's mind raced. She thought about the fires, the ruined lives of the former tenants, and her family's downward spiral. It all made sense now. What can I do? She asked, her voice trembling. How can I save my family? Prophet Ezekiel shook his head. It will not be easy. The curse is powerful. Even if you leave the house, the curse may follow you unless it is broken. To stop it, the building must remain unoccupied for at least 1 month. Only then will the dark power weaken and die. Shaken but determined, Imam decided to confront Mama Anurika, the petty trader across the street, once more. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. Later that evening, Imam approached Mama Anurika's shop, her heart pounding. The older woman greeted her with a wary smile, as if she already knew what was coming. Mama, I need the truth, Imam said firmly. You know something about that house. The Prophet has told me part of the story, but I need to hear it from you. Mama Anurika hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around. Madam, I don't know what you're talking about. Mama, please, Imam interrupted, her voice breaking. My family is suffering. My husband lost his job, my son is failing in school, and my business is falling apart. If you know anything that can help us, I beg you, tell me. The old woman sighed deeply, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. Finally, she gestured for Imam to step closer. I didn't want trouble, Mama Anurika began, her voice barely above a whisper. That house has been cursed from the day it was built. Mr. Ozumba's father was the one who started it all. He was a powerful man in the cult, and when he built the house, he made it a place of sacrifice. The bricks, those red bricks, were made with the blood of innocent lives. That's why tenants suffer or die when they move in. Imam's knees felt weak, but she gripped the counter to steady herself. What about the fires? She asked. The tenants who left and had their new homes burned down. Mama Anurika nodded sadly. That's the curse following them. The house doesn't like to let people go. But those who survive the fires, they carry bad luck for the rest of their lives. That's why I always warn people not to move in. But for those already inside, she trailed off, her eyes filled with guilt. You stay silent, Imam finished, anger and despair bubbling inside her. Imam left Mama Anurika's shop with a mixture of fear and determination. She couldn't let this curse destroy her family. As she walked back to the building, she looked up at the towering red brick structure, its darkened windows staring back at her like soulless eyes. She didn't know how she was going to do it, but one thing was clear. She had to find a way to break the curse. Time was running out, and the red brick house seemed more alive and more dangerous than ever. Imam sat on the edge of her bed that night, staring at the flickering bulb above her. Prophet Ezekiel's warning echoed in her mind. Even if you leave, the curse will follow you unless the landlord's ritual is broken. She hugged herself tightly, her heart heavy with fear. She thought of her children, their future, and how everything had spiraled into chaos since they moved into the red brick house. She had to act, and fast. The next morning, Imam knocked on Mr. Ajaluchikwa's door. He was a retired teacher who lived alone in the flat above hers. He opened the door cautiously, his wrinkled face peering out suspiciously. Good morning, Mama Idara, he said, using her eldest child's name to address her. Good morning, sir, Imam replied, her voice low. Please, I need to talk to you. It's about the house. They sat in his sparsely furnished living room, the faint smell of camphor lingering in the air. Imam explained everything the Prophet had told her. She talked about the cursed bricks, the blood sacrifices, and the landlord's sinister connection to their misfortunes. Mr. Ajaluchikwa's expression darkened as she spoke. I knew it, he muttered under his breath. I've been living here for over a year, and nothing has gone right for me since. My health has declined, and my savings have all but disappeared. And that landlord. He's always buying flashy things, always smiling as if nothing ever bothers him. Encouraged by his reaction, Imam decided to include the last tenant, Mrs. Chioma, a young widow who lived on the ground floor. Later that evening, Imam and Mr. Ajaluchukwu knocked on Mrs. Chioma's door. She opened it with a tired smile, her 2-year-old son clinging to her leg. "Good evening," she said. "Is everything okay?" "Not really," Imam replied. "We need to talk. It's important." The three of them sat in Mrs. Chioma's tiny kitchen while her son played quietly with a plastic toy. Imam repeated everything she had learned, sparing no details. Mrs. Chioma's eyes widened in shock, and she held her chest as if to steady herself. "No wonder my shop hasn't had customers in weeks," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I thought it was just bad luck. But now, it all makes sense." "I've been thinking," Imam said, her voice firm. "The Prophet said the curse can only be broken if the house stays empty for at least a month. We need to leave, but not just us. The house must be completely unoccupied." "But how?" Mrs. Chioma asked. "If the landlord finds out we're all leaving at once, he'll try to stop us. He'll bring in new tenants immediately. That's why we have to be smart," Imam said. "We leave quietly, one by one, without telling him." The 3 tenants worked together, whispering their plans during hushed meetings and making sure Mr. Ozumba didn't suspect a thing. They decided to stagger their departures over several days to avoid raising suspicion. Mrs. Chioma was the first to move. She packed her belongings gradually, using her brother's car to transport them at night. By the end of the week, her flat was empty, and she and her son were safely staying with relatives. Next was Mr. Ajaluchukwu. He donated most of his furniture to a local charity, saying he wanted to declutter. A week later, he packed his remaining belongings into a single suitcase and left for his hometown. Finally, it was Imam's turn. She and Effiong had been arguing about the plan for days, but after much persuasion, he reluctantly agreed. "Imam, are you sure about this?" Effiong asked as they packed their few possessions late one night. "Yes," she replied firmly. "I'd rather risk everything than stay in this cursed house." By dawn, the Ikpaya family was gone. A week after Imam's family left, Mr. Ozumba arrived at the building, confused and angry. He walked from flat to flat, banging on doors and shouting. "Where is everyone?" he yelled, his voice echoing through the empty corridors. He called his real estate agents, demanding they find new tenants immediately. But Imam and the others had spread word around the neighborhood, warning people about the cursed house. Flyers appeared mysteriously on notice boards, and whispers of the house's dark history spread like wildfire. No one dared to rent the flats, no matter how low the rent was. For weeks, the building stood empty, its once bright red bricks now dull and lifeless. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the walls. By the 4th week, strange things began happening. People reported hearing faint cries coming from the house at night. A local boy claimed he saw smoke rising from the roof, even though there was no fire. Then one morning news broke. Mr. Ozumba was found dead in his car, parked outside the house. His face was frozen in a mask of terror, his hands clutching the steering wheel tightly. Even his family did not come back to take his body for a proper burial. The curse had been broken. The house remained abandoned, its dark secrets buried within its walls. The Ikpaya family, along with the others, slowly began rebuilding their lives. Imam, now stronger and wiser, made it her mission to warn others. Not every house is meant to be a home. Always ask questions and never ignore the signs. Some walls are built with more than just bricks.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to stay connected by leaving your thoughts in the comments, giving the video a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when a new content drops. We appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you in the next video.